Lesson 7, Buddhism. The term Buddhism is applied both to the philosophy of Gautama Buddha, and also to the vast system of religion which has been evolved from his teachings, with its accompaniment or elaborate ceremonial and ritual, and which counts its followers to the number of perhaps 300 million, principally in China, Japan and Tibet, and including about 10 million followers in India, chiefly in Burma. The number of Buddhists in India proper, the land of its founder, having decreased until the religion is practically dead in the land of its origin, its philosophy being kept alive principally by its influence upon the surviving philosophies. In India, it still numbers followers among the northern tribes, and is quite flourishing in the whole Indo-Chinese peninsula, Burma, Ceylon, Nepal, etc., but is almost unknown in the center of India. It claims millions of followers in China and Japan, which are its great strongholds, and it has another great center north of the Himalayas, in Tibet, where it is the prevailing religion, under the name of Lamaism. It is the popular religion among the entire Mongolian sections and peoples of Asia, and is found to the extreme north of Siberia, and even in Lapland. But the present form of the Buddhist religion, particularly as it appears among the Japanese and Chinese, and in Tibet and the north, generally has very little resemblance to the original teachings of Gautama. The Buddhists of Burma adhere more closely to the orthodox teachings, but even their Buddhism is held more as a religious system and church, than as a philosophical system, and yet the original philosophy of Gautama Buddha exerted a wonderful influence on the philosophical thought of India, and having played its part, it passed from the scene and now lives only in the shape of a religion, and as the basis for the philosophical conceptions of others, East and West. Buddhism dates back to about 600 BC, the time of Gautama its founder, and has for its birthplace India. Gautama, the Buddha, was a prince by the name of Siddhartha, who was also known by the name of Sakyamuni, the term meaning the solitary one of the family of Sakya. The term Buddha means the illumined mind, or enlightenment, and is a term bestowed upon Gautama by reason of his spiritual illumination. The titles of Bhagavat, or the Blessed One, and the Bodhisattva are also frequently used in reference to Gautama. There is a great mass of legendary lore connected with the early life of Gautama, which has been carefully combined and beautifully stated in the poem entitled The Light of Asia, by Edwin Arnold, the English poet. According to the legends, Gautama, the Prince Siddhartha, in his boyhood developed a tendency toward philosophical thought and speculation, and his father, who desired him to become a famous warrior, hastened him to an early marriage, and placed him in environments calculated to keep his mind away from the misery and pain of the world, and surrounded with the luxury and sensuous splendor of an oriental court. All sickness, disease, and death was kept from the sight and knowledge of the prince, and nothing but brightness and joy was allowed to enter into his life. But, notwithstanding this, the young prince began to tire of the perpetual round of pleasure which palled upon him, and led him to declare that all is vanity and idle dissipation, satisfying not the mind or the soul. One day, escaping from his bounds, he discovered that misery, pain and disease are the common occurrences of life, and that death the reaper ever stands ready to mow down man as the grass of the field. Behind all he heard ever the tinkle of the camel bell, as the Persian poet has called it, the warning of approaching death. He therefore determined to forsake all and become an ascetic, and in that life to seek the peace which the world had failed to give him. He escaped from his father's palace, and fled to the jungle. He met the various Brahmin philosophers, and studied their doctrines, but still peace evaded him. Asceticism and self-punishment also failed to bring the coveted reward. And so at last he came to the conclusion that peace can come only from within, and he began a life of meditation and mental self-examination, with concentration upon the idea of the source of pain and sorrow. He determined to conquer the difficulty by sheer force of mind. And so he sat beneath the famous Bo tree for weeks at a time, plunged in the most profound meditation, and abstract thought. At last nirvana, or transcendental illumination, came to him, and he saw clearly the cause of phenomenal life and the pain attendant thereupon, and also the way of escape. He saw that in samsara, or the cycle of existences, is to be found the source of pain. For, he reasoned, if we were not born and reborn, we should not be subject to pain, sickness, misery, old age and death. And then reasoning backwards, he finds that the cause of samsara lies in desire, and its continuance upon ignorance. Therefore, he who masters ignorance, and who is strong enough to kill out desire, may escape the bonds of samsara, the wheel of life, and attain nirvana or peace. And then came the final stage, in which he set himself mentally free from samsara, and attained nirvana on earth, to be followed by parinirvana after he passed from the body, the chain of rebirth being broken, and samsara being defeated. And then Gautama went forth as a teacher of freedom and emancipation, and the founder of his school or system, which afterward developed into the Buddhist religion and church. He made many and important converts, and firmly established his philosophical system, and his system of morality which rose therefrom, before his death, which occurred in Kusinagara. Let us first examine the fundamental conceptions of the Buddhist system of philosophy. In the first place, a reference to many of the English books upon Buddhism will give the student the impression that Gautama taught an atheistic philosophy, which closely approached materialism, denying any reality back of phenomenal life, and refusing to admit the existence of Brahman, and that also he denied the existence of the soul, although he explained reincarnation under the desperate expedient of karma, which afforded a connecting link between the lives of the successive beings in the chain of rebirth or samsara. On both of these points Western discussion has raged fiercely, some holding to the above ideas, while others attempted to combat them. We think that when the fundamental principles of the inner teachings of the Hindu philosophies are applied to the teachings of Buddha, order may be brought out of chaos. Such is the opinion of the advanced Hindu teachers, non-Buddhists, remember, who would protect Gautama from the attacks of his orthodox Hindu opponents, and the Western writers on Buddhism. Let us examine into the matter. In the first place, Gautama did not deny the existence of Brahman, but simply refused to speculate regarding its nature, character and being, holding that the concern of man was with the phenomenal world and the escape therefrom, and that speculation upon Brahman was useless and a waste of time enough to know that that was his idea. He denied the existence of Ishwara, the personal god, of the Hindus, and thus brought upon himself the reproach of atheism, which had also been visited upon the heads of Kapila and other philosophical teachers. But Gautama did not deny the existence of that, he merely took it for granted without argument as a fundamental axiomatic truth. Nay, more, in his system he clearly indicated the existence of a Parabrahm, or Supreme Brahman, that is a Brahman in the aspect of non-being, or non-manifestation. Gautama has been described as postulating a nothing from which the phenomenal universe emerged, and into which it would return. Now, anyone at all familiar with the fundamental conceptions of the Hindu philosophical thought knows that the one positive position from which the Hindu mind refuses to budge, is the idea that something never can come from nothing, nor can something be resolved into nothing, or, as it is often expressed, from nothing, nothing comes. And, moreover, to suppose that the nirvana, or soul freedom, of Gautama was a state of nothingness or annihilation, shows a profound ignorance of the fundamental conceptions of the Buddhist philosophy, as well as of the general Hindu, or even the general Oriental, thought, through all of which the thread of an ultimate universal consciousness runs unbroken. And yet you will find the majority of Western writers on Buddhism assuring you that nirvana, the goal of the Buddhist, is a state of nothingness, or a state of annihilation. Nirvana is the annihilation of Maya, blowing out of avidya, or ignorance, and a state of universal inner consciousness, rather than an extinction of consciousness. And if these Western writers fail to grasp even this important point of the Buddhist teachings, how can you expect them to grasp the subtle minor points of doctrine? As we have said, Gautama refused to speculate upon the absolute, that, Brahman, or the nominal. But instead of denying its existence, he merely treated it as unexistent, unknowable, a position very similar to that of Herbert Spencer, the great English philosopher, whom men mistakenly call a materialist, although he clearly and positively postulates an unknowable upon which the entire phenomenal universe or the knowable depends and is sustained. Gautama admits this unknowable, and although he treats it as a no thing, he does not claim it is nothing, it is simply that which is entirely different from and antecedent to things. So subtle is Gautama's conception and analysis that it is no wonder that his meaning escapes the observation of the Western examiners of his teachings. For not only does he consider the absolute in action, or that manifesting, as the unknowable, but he also perceives to exist a para-Brahm, that is, that in its aspect of rest and not activity Brahman divested even of Maya and the illusory universe. To use Western terms, Gautama's highest and ultimate conception was that of a thing in itself with all of its manifestations vanished, the absolute as non-being, as distinguished from the absolute as being. But as all advanced Western students of philosophy know full well, non-being does not mean nothing, but is the term used to designate reality in pure essence, as distinguished from reality manifesting relativity. And so we state positively that a careful study of the original teachings of Gautama will reveal the fact that he did not teach the doctrine of ultimate nothingness or nihilism, but that his no thing was identical with the Western conception of non-being, which is really the highest conception of reality beyond being, and that he recognized that in its purest essence as the fundamental reality underlying all that is in appearance. Without this basic conception, the entire philosophy of Gautama would fall to the ground, would be meaningless, would be a doctrine of something proceeding from nothing into nothing, returning in order to gain freedom, a palpable absurdity lacking all sanity, and opposed to every principle and instinct of Hindu thought. Gautama indeed taught the nothingness of the phenomenal life, or samsara, even surpassing the Advaitist Vedantists in his conception of the nature of Maya, which he denounced as the purest ignorance lacking even a shadow of truth or reality, a lie in the mind of the Absolute. But upon that he founded his teachings, upon that which is ever present in all Hindu thought, that which if removed would bring all Hindu thought tumbling in shattered bits beyond possibility of repair or restoration. Gautama was considered as an iconoclast, an infidel, an atheist even, in the eyes of the Orthodox Church of India, but he was not a fool, claiming a nothing as a basis for all things. Surely the interpreters of Buddha have inverted his pyramid of thought. While Gautama forbade all speculation regarding the nature of the unknowable, holding that the ultimate questions could not be grasped by the human mind, although all would be understood when the state of nirvana was reached, still from the sidelights which he threw upon his doctrines from time to time, it may be stated that his inner teachings, arising from his transcendental knowledge gained in his state of nirvana or illumination, were that the fundamental reality, or that, in its essence, was equivalent to non-being, when contrasted with being as the human mind understands the latter term. Non-being is not non-existence, but rather existence in a state devoid of attributes, qualities, or activities, so far as manifestation is concerned. Although all possible manifestation must be latent therein, in fact the meaning of non-being may be stated as being, in latency. The distinction is highly metaphysical, but some of the ancient Grecian philosophers, and those of the modern West, have recognized the distinction, and embodied it in their metaphysical systems, as for instance Hegel, who states that non-being and being are one. This conception of non-being is also recognized by certain Hindu metaphysicians who postulated a para-Brahm, or supreme Brahm, or essential Brahm, beyond the Brahman in its phase of the active cause of the universe. It is one of the very utmost tenuities or refinements of subtle distinction in metaphysical thought, and it is no wonder that Gautama was charged with advancing a doctrine of the nothingness of reality, for to the average mind non-being must seem to partake more of nothingness than of thingness. But Gautama saw the distinction, and indeed upon it depends his distinction between nirvana and parinirvana, as we shall see presently. From non-being, or para-Brahm, proceeded being or Brahman, although Gautama avoided the use of these customary terms, wishing to free his teachings from the conceptions attached to the old terminology. Non-being was that all that is, and besides it was nothing. And from non-being, or that, arose or proceeded being, or a manifestation as universal consciousness or creative mind, or universal soul. Gautama positively refused to explain, or to allow discussion upon the nature or reason for this proceeding of manifestation of being, claiming the ordinary mind could not grasp this truth, but that it would be made plain and clear when the state of nirvana was reached. Then being proceeded to manifest the lust of life, which corresponds closely to Schopenhauer's will to live, except that the latter is conceived as being a thing in itself, while the lust of life is merely a phenomenal manifestation or appearance. This lust of life arose from being according to the chain of consequences or causal evolution, which is stated as follows. First, from avidya or ignorance arose illusory ideas or the consciousness of separateness. The lust of life, or desire for objective experience, then the psychic basis for the sense organism, then the contact through these sense organs with outside objects, then vague perception or feeling, then desire for things, then attachment to objects, then human birth, and then the circumstances of life, viz., life, old age, death, grief, pain, etc. The karma arising from the life, then rebirth, and samsara, until emancipation or freedom is gained. And avidya or ignorance was the beginning of a chain and is the final enemy to be overthrown, and the prime form of ignorance is the illusion of separateness. The lust of life, judging from the many allusions to it on the part of Gautama, and the early Buddhist teachers and commenters, may be considered as a fierce, lustful longing, hunger or thirst for objective existence, acting along unconscious or instinctive lines, which afterward manifested consciousness in some of its forms of creation or manifestation, and which was manifested in everything from the atom to man, including the plant life, and the animal forms, in fact, and all living things. Some have defined it as a life itself, as we understand it, in all of its manifestations and forms. Some have called it by the name of the creative will, while others have identified it with nature. To all, however, it is recognized as meaning that instinctive, persistent, craving, striving, acting, doing, longing, changing, living force, that is ever manifesting through all the phenomenal shapes and forms in the world, creating, preserving, and then destroying each form. Constant change, and becoming nothing, remaining intact, building up, and tearing down, being born, growing, becoming old, dying only to be succeeded by other forms, new life springing from the very bodies of the dead forms. And this is the lust of life. Gautama taught that the very essence of the lust of life was kama, or desire. Desire was the moving spirit of the lust of life, its motive force and inciter to action. Everything comes from desire in one form or the other, and it is impossible to escape it except by killing it outright, taught Gautama. Renunciation of desire is the only hope, said he to his disciples, and his entire teaching is bent toward this renunciation of life, by the killing out of desire. This is the keynote of Gautama's teaching, from first to last. Arising from the lust of life, with its motive force of desire, arises samsara, or the cycle of existence, which constitutes the world of error, guilt, sorrow, death, birth, decay, disappointment, suffering, and, unless escaped from, the endless, ceaseless cycle of rebirth and re-embodiment under the law of karma. Samsara is held to be really naught but the result of ignorance brought about by the lust of life, and the desire for expression in objective existence. But while it lasts, it is terribly real, a nightmare of the self, and it will ever last until desire is renounced, and emancipation gained. Desire holds all in the embrace of samsara, from the unconscious atoms, minerals, plants, and animals, until in man desire culminates in manifestations of sensuality, striving for personal gain, selfish aims, personal desires, aversions, and inclinations, in short, in all of the attributes of personality, from which arises selfishness and separateness. The student will notice the similarity of Gautama's conception of the lust of life with the Sankhayan principle of Prakriti, and the Vedantic idea of the Maya overlying reality, and from which spring the phenomena life with its samsara, or cycle of existences, from which the soul struggles to escape. This idea is ever present in the Hindu philosophies, the soul far from home, striving and struggling to find its way back to the shelter of home. Even Newman, in his hymn, Lead, Kindly Light, voices this intuitional conviction: for I am a stranger, far from home, lead thou me on. Buddhism follows closely upon the older Sankhayan conception of the spirit entangled in Prakriti, and striving to escape, although Gautama differs materially in his interpretation of the soul, as we shall see presently. Professor Garb says in his Philosophy of Ancient India, the Sankhya system supplied, in all main outlines, the foundations of Jainism and Buddhism, two philosophically embellished religions, which start from the idea that this life is nothing but suffering, and always revert to the thought. According to them, the cause of suffering is the desire to live and enjoy the delights of the world, and in the last instance the ignorance from which this desire proceeds, the means of the abolition of this ignorance, and therewith of suffering, is the annihilation of that desire, renunciation of the world, and a most boundless love toward all creatures. And now, before proceeding to consider Gautama's plan for the escape of the suffering soul from samsara, Let us first consider the second heresy of Gautama, according to his critics, namely, his denial of the existence of the soul, of which grave offense he has been charged by Hindu followers of opposing systems, who considered Gautama heterodox, and also by the Western critics who failed to grasp the fundamental ideas of his doctrine, and to accuse him of inventing a mechanical karma to connect the different lives, under the law of reincarnation, in absence of the soul. If there is no soul, objected these critics, how can rebirth occur? What is there to reincarnate? And yet see how easily the matter straightens itself out, when understood in the light of the general Hindu philosophy. Just as Gautama was called an atheist because he refused to acknowledge Ishvara, so is he called a teacher of soullessness, because he will not admit the individual Purushas of Kapila, although adopting the Prakriti conception of the latter teacher. In the first place, Gautama, holding that all the phenomenal world was Maya or illusion, in its strictest sense and carried to its final logical conclusion, refused to admit of the existence of the individual soul, claiming that the sense of separateness was due solely to avidya, or ignorance, or Maya, or illusion, and that there could be no such thing as an individual entity, or soul, in reality, as all was that and nothing else. Consequently, the individual soul was regarded as a part of the figment of an illusory phenomenal world. When examined carefully, it will be seen that Gautama claims nothing more, in this respect, than does the Advaitist Vedanta with its Tattvamasa, that thou art the individual soul being considered merely as the result of the one appearing as the many. But Gautama really goes a little further, and refuses to admit even the appearance of an individual soul, or spirit entity, claiming that the same is not necessary to account for the sense of personality, or to explain reincarnation. Critics have claimed that Gautama used the desperate expedient of the principle of karma to carry the effects of the causes of one life over into the next, which idea was held to postulate a great injustice, because it would be the bestowing upon one individual of the effects of causes generated by another individual. But this is not so, because the only individual affected is the same in both cases, just as is the man of 60 the same individual as the man of 20, or the child of 6, although appearing differently to an observer. The whole trouble arises from the understanding of the word soul. To the Sankhya's, the soul was the individual Purusha, an entity gathering to itself certain qualities and attributes from the mental evolution of the Prakriti, that is, that a soul was something different from its mind being the spirit or permanent thing, animating the mind, or impermanent thing the soul being a persistent principle. Now Gautama would not admit this principle of the individual soul, even as being a manifestation of and one of the dual principles emanated by that. Instead, he held that the only spirit in man was the animating reflection or manifestation of the undivided one spirit of that he, holding that there was no separate soul other than the character of the individual, which character consisted of the attributes and qualities of the man, his personal nature, or characteristics considered as a whole. This character he held was the only soul that man had, or could have, and that it was that character which reincarnated in a new body, under the laws of karma. In other words, this character was the essence of the man's thoughts and actions, held together firmly, and constituting an I which was individual but which was not a real and eternal entity. In discussing this point with the Brahmins, and he had many opportunities so to do, Gautama would illustrate it by comparing the soul with a chariot, which was composed of wheels, body, axle, floor, tongue, etc., but which was nothing in itself when these parts were taken away from it. So he held that if all the attributes were taken away from a man, there would be no soul left. Or, another illustration, man's soul was like an Indian bulb akin to an onion, which when stripped of its successive layers of skin in search for the real onion or the onion in itself, resulted in nothing being left. His opponents would answer, yes, but there would remain the Purusha, or spirit. But Gautama would answer saying, there would be naught remaining but the spirit of that, the unknowable, divest the man of his attributes or character, and there is nothing left but that which is no thing, and which is unknowable. And this is why they claimed that Gautama denied the immortal soul. They overlooked the fact that this stripping away of the attributes or characteristics is just what Gautama sought to accomplish by killing out desire, and thus resolving man back to that, or non-being, which indeed, in reality, was all that man was. Read this over, carefully, and you will see the finesse of Gautama's logic and reasoning, and why he out-reasoned the Brahmins. A word here regarding the reason that Gautama and Buddhism always have been regarded as heterodox, and outside of the pale of the orthodox Hindu philosophical systems. You will notice that Buddhism is always treated as an outside system. You will notice that the six systems, differing as they do from the orthodox religious dogmas of the Brahmins, and differing from each other, are still considered orthodox, even though they deny the existence of every god in the Hindu pantheon, as does Kapila, even to the extent of denying Ishwara, the personal god of the universe. In Gautama's Buddhism, which denies but little if anything more, is regarded as non-orthodox. The reason is simple, when understood. And here it is: in India, among the Brahmins, or priestly caste, there exists a wonderful degree of liberty of philosophical or theological speculation, without the danger of being read out of the fold, or excommunication. No matter how bold the speculation, or how startling the doctrine, it is not opposed or considered non-orthodox, providing always that the teachers recognize the inspiration of the Vedas and providing still more strongly that they recognize the caste system of India, particularly the high nature of the Brahmin, or priestly caste, the members of which are considered to be twice born and almost sacred, and who take precedence of even kings and rulers, who are generally of the Kshatriya or warrior caste. The Brahmins were considered as little less than gods. Some of the old works contain sentences like this: there be two classes of gods, the real gods, and the Brahmins who expound the Vedas. The Brahmins are even more than gods, for do they not protect and supply with sacrifices the gods themselves? Etc. And so it may be seen why adherence to the doctrine of the semi-divine priesthood, and the inspiration of the Vedas was considered a requisite to even this broad orthodoxy. It is as if the Christian Church of the Middle Ages, or even later, were to have said, teach any philosophy that you wish, providing you always assert the inspiration of the Holy Scriptures, and the virtue and infallibility of the Church and priesthood. Now, while the teachers of the six systems taught doctrines in direct variance with the orthodox teachings to the masses, still they never disputed the virtue of the Vedas, and were free with the texts from the same. In fact, they built up their systems on the teachings of the Upanishads, as interpreted by themselves. And they always bowed to the caste system, and the virtue of the Brahmins, and so were considered orthodox. It was more of an acknowledgement of the authority of the Brahmins than any agreement to the teachings of the Church. But Buddha would have none of this. He taught universal brotherhood, and did much to weaken the hold of the caste system. He neither denied nor affirmed the infallibility of the Vedas but largely ignored them, and built up his system on human reason aided by transcendental illumination. Gautama opposed the system of sacrifices, and denounced the ceremonies and the rituals of no avail. He also condemned the practice of austerities and self-torture. He taught democracy and universal brotherly love. All men were his brothers, Sudra and Brahmin alike. Is it any wonder that he was considered non-orthodox by the priestly caste, and denounced for atheism and denying the existence of the soul, even when he went no further in those directions than did many others of orthodox tendencies? Gautama has also been charged with materialism and earthliness, because he refused to encourage speculation regarding subjects outside of the earth life and the duties concerning the same. This course he followed because he saw that the Hindu people had lost sight of works by dwelling too much upon doctrine, and he sought to awaken them to an activity here and now. Not only did he teach them to do things in the direction of attaining freedom and emancipation, but he inculcated new truths regarding human duties toward one's fellow men, comparable only to the teaching in this direction of Jesus of Nazareth, who followed him 600 years later. Professor Jackson says, the element in Buddhism which more than any other, perhaps, gave it an advantage over all surrounding religions, and led to its surprising extension, was the spirit of universal charity and sympathy that it breathed, as contrasted with the exclusiveness of caste. In this respect, it held much the same relation to Brahmanism that Christianity did to Judaism. It was, in fact, a reaction against the exclusiveness and formalism of Brahmanism, an attempt to render it more Catholic, and to throw off its intolerable burden of ceremonies. Buddhism did not expressly abolish caste, but only declared that all followers of the Buddha who embraced the religious life were thereby released from its restrictions in the bosom of a community who had all equally renounced the world, high and low, the twice-born Brahmin and the outcast were brethren. This was the very way that Christianity dealt with the slavery of the ancient world. And Max Ma 1/4 says, the Buddha addressed himself to all castes and outcasts. He promised salvation to all, and he commanded his disciples to preach his doctrine in all places and to all men. A sense of duty, extending from the narrow limits of the house, the village, and the country, to the widest circle of mankind, a feeling of sympathy and brotherhood to all men, the idea, in fact, of humanity, were first pronounced by Buddha. Gautama held that the fundamental cause of suffering and unhappiness in samsara was the sense of separateness by which the I was deluded or hypnotized. This sense of separateness brought in its train selfishness, greed, strife, conflict, and all the other evil manifestations that make of life in samsara a nightmare of suffering. In other words, separateness is the root of evil, and all manifestations of evil may be traced back to its common source. And therefore all of Gautama's teachings were directed toward escape from this illusion of separateness, by means of killing out the desire which was its very life energy. And all of the vague longing that possesses the human soul arises from an intuitive realization that it belongs to a larger life, and that separateness prevents it from realizing itself. The essence of the doctrine seems to be the following conception: although its original purity has been clouded by the additions of the Church which has arisen from the teachings, and which has governed over the light of the true teachings by the colored shade of ecclesiasticism. But this seems to be the original teaching, that, from not being, or that, emerged a portion, or aspect of itself which manifested as being, which in turn manifesting the chain of consequences, evolved the lust of life, the moving principle of which is kama or desire, and from which arose samsara, or the cycle of existence is the wheel of life. The avidya, or ignorance, from which arose the lust of life and desire, had as its essence the illusion of personality, or separateness, the breaking up of the cosmic consciousness into countless personalities or centers of consciousness of qualities which men call souls. The souls are not entities but merely aggregates of qualities and attributes, composing characters, which are illumined and energized by the one spirit of that, which appears as the many spirits of the souls, by reason of the illusion. Intuitively every soul feels that it is really identical with the universal life and soul, and experiences unhappiness and uneasiness by reason of its isolation, and yearns to return to its original state of oneness. And the selfish life, aims, thoughts and actions engendered by this illusion of separateness brings into existence evil, with its multitudinous train of manifestations and consequences. Each desire brings forth a brood of new desires, and the soul is bound fast in the entanglements of karmic cause and effect. The only escape is by first learning the cause of evil, and then proceeding to eradicate it, working from the manifestations back to the cause, and then back until freedom is obtained. Thus by killing out all desire, one strips the lust of life of its power, and renders it easy to be overcome. The lust of life once overcome, the soul realizes that it is not a personality or separate entity, but that it is being itself, that is, that in the state of creative activity. Thus the soul as a personality disappears, for when the soul perceives that it is the universal being, then all sense of separateness is dissolved. The dewdrop slips into the shining sea, the character dissolves and the spirit alone remains. And then still there is another stage, when finally the liberated soul, surrendering all, even its cosmic consciousness or being, retires into the very heart of that, into Parabrahma, the abysmal abyss or non-being, and attains paranirvana, the bliss absolute. Such is the essence of Buddhism. Gautama taught the four truths of salvation, which must be grasped by all seekers of escape. 1. The truth of suffering, or the realization that life is indeed suffering. 2. The truth of the cause of suffering, or the lust of life fed by desire. 3. The truth of the cessation of suffering, or the knowledge that in the overcoming of the lust of life lies the cessation of samsara. 4. The truth of the path that leads to the cessation of suffering, or the methods of killing out desire, whereby the lust of life is overcome and freedom gained. Gautama taught that if the desires were killed out, then the character or personality, which is composed of the qualities and attributes engendered by desire, must dissolve, leaving the spirit intact and unclouded, no longer deluded by the sense of separateness, and realizing its identity with the whole. That therefore anything that tended to kill out desire was a step on the path. He had experienced, in his own life, the sense of the futility of ceremonialism and ritual, and had tested asceticism and austerities, and proved them worthless. Therefore all that remained for the seeker after freedom to do was to kill out desire. Here is where Gautama struck a new note in India. Not by violent repression of desire was it killed, he argued, for that only fed the appetite of the beast by arousing an internal hunger, but by avoiding all selfish acts and devoting one's life to unselfish deeds, and acts of service to one's fellows by love for all living things. Gautama held that by thus turning the life energies out towards others, selfishness was dissolved and disappeared, and the mind was purged of desire, and the lust of life was overcome, and nirvana reached. This was the path of the cessation of suffering. It will be noticed that in the majority of the Hindu philosophies, freedom and emancipation were held to be gained by the ultimate absorption of the individual soul in the universal soul or Brahman. The Advaitist Vedanta, not believing in the absolute existence of the individual soul, holds the emancipation comes from the individual, who is really Brahman in disguise, deluded by Maya, awakening to a realization that he is not an individual, but is Brahman himself. Buddhism, not recognizing an individual soul, or even the temporary phenomenal separate entity called soul, the Buddhist soul being but a bundle of desires, habits, etc., called character, illumined by the one spirit, does not lead the soul to recognition of the real self in the manner of the Advaitist Vedanta, but instead reaches the emancipation by leading the mind to a knowledge of the true state of affairs, teaching it that it, as a soul, does not exist, and then bidding it to deliberately destroy and dissolve itself by the burning out and destroying of desire, to the end that finally, when all desire is burned out and destroyed, then the soul will vanish and the real self alone will be left in its place. Nirvana is the state of actual realization of the oneness of life, and that the many are one. Parinirvana is the withdrawal from activity entirely, and dissolving into Parabrahm, or non-being, to return no more in incarnation. Samsara entirely escaped. Nirvana is attained in the flesh, and is not an annihilation as has been taught, but a state of cosmic consciousness, a glimpse of the Satchitananda, or existence, knowledge, bliss absolute, a desireless being. The soul may pass out of the body after nirvana, and may dwell on certain planes of being, helping the race to escape its bondage. Such are the masters and adepts, of which we have heard, the elder brethren of the race, who forego the bliss absolute for eons in order to render service to the race. But beyond it all is the entrance into parinirvana, dissolution into Parabrahm, sinking into the abysmal abyss, eternal peace and rest absolute. Gautama's way of escape comprised 8 points, namely, 1. Right faith, 2. Right judgment, 3. Right speech, 4. Right purpose, 5. Right action, 6. Right endeavor, 7. Right thinking, 8. Right meditation. These 8 points in the way of escape may be understood only by a comprehension of Gautama's concatenation of causes, or chain of causation, which is based upon the fundamental idea of the second truth of salvation, namely, the cause of suffering, which holds that the cause of pain and suffering is the lust of life and desire. The immediate cause of pain is birth, for were we not born we would not suffer. Birth, in turn, is caused by the karma of previous existences, of which it is a continuation and effect, and the character or soul is the result of the experiences of the past reincarnation, and karma, in turn, have their cause in previous desire. Desire is held to be caused by perception, and perception by contact, and finally ideas are held to be an early cause, and ideas are held to be the result of avidya or ignorance, which mistakes the illusory and transitory for the real and permanent. Therefore avidya or ignorance is the root of causes to be attacked, and avidya is destroyed by opening the windows of the mind and letting the sunshine of truth pour in, which will dispel the darkness of avidya. Vidya or knowledge is the antidote for avidya or ignorance. Destroy avidya or ignorance, and the resulting chain of consequences, viz., illusory ideas, distinction of forms, sense impressions, contact, perception, desire, attachment, existence, birth, misery, old age, death, samsara, maya, illusion, all vanish, and nirvana is attained. We shall not take up space to enumerate the exhaustive moral code of Buddhism, enough to say that it formulates a moral code going to the extreme detail of conduct, embracing the world ideas of honesty, chastity, kindness, unselfishness, morality, benevolence, truth, etc., etc. The greater part of this code is the work of the teachers who followed Buddha, and the various later church councils arising from the crystallizing of Buddha's teachings into a church. As usual in such cases, the church has invented many new forms, ceremonials, and dogmas, and has had many schisms and subdivisions in denominations. In the South, the division of the Buddhists, which is called Southern Buddhism, has held nearer to the original teachings than has Northern Buddhism, which has added and changed materially, particularly in the direction of altering Gautama's original conception of the soul as character, and replacing it with an individual soul or purusha. The Church has added many heavens and hells, particularly the latter, of which there are several hundred, the period of sojourn in some of these hells being as high as 10 millions of years, and being as full of torture as the orthodox Middle Age Christian hell. In some of the highest heavens, the happy soul is held to dwell for as long as 10 billion years. And so it goes, as churches and priests have ever gone building up an edifice of dogma and creed, ritual and ceremonial upon simple philosophical teaching. The doctrine of karma has been so distorted that it now forms the most effective ecclesiastical weapon of rule ever invented by the mind of man. The Church teaches that a man is born blind because he looked too much upon the things of sense in past lives, that he is deaf because in past lives he would not listen to the teachings of the doctrine and creeds, that he is dumb because in a past life he mocked and reviled the priests, and so on, according to the custom of the Church everywhere. In the North, Buddhism is taught under the name of Lamaism, with elaborate ceremonialism and ritual. Northern Buddhism is so rich in ritual and ceremony that the early Jesuit missionaries, finding the ritual and forms bearing such a remarkable resemblance to some of the ceremonies and ritual of their own church, reported that it was undoubtedly the work of the devil, who had invented Buddhism as a mockery of the true church. Northern India, and Tibet, is filled with hordes of mendicant Buddhist monks, who subsist by begging from the people, living in monasteries endowed by the faithful. Images of Buddha abound, and he is regarded as a deity, although the teachings expressly hold otherwise. Is it not an irony of fate, that Gautama, whose work was in the direction of undoing the work of priests and established religions, and whose teachings were directed toward aiding the race to escape vain forms, creeds, and ceremonies, and to make them think and act for themselves, that his teachings should have served as the basis for a church and creed, whose followers rank second, if not first numerically, in the list of the churches? Like Jesus, Gautama came as a teacher without temples, organizations or creeds, and like him, he unwittingly became the founder of a great church, with creeds, dogmas, theologies, forms, ritual and ceremonies, priests and ecclesiasticism. Wherever form and dogmas supplant the spirit of the truth, then churches crystallize and the living faith burns low. It ever has been so, and ever will be so. In the East, so in the West. But Gautama taught, as did the Krishna of the Hindus, that when the spirit is almost extinguished, then comes a new messenger of spirit, to revive the truth. Gautama is held to be but one of a line of Buddhas, or great spiritual teachers, avatars of divinity, who have come, and will come to save the race from rank materialism and darkness of avidya. Gautama said, whenever the pure doctrine threatens to fall entirely into disuse, and mankind again sinks into sensual desires and mental darkness, then a new Buddha is born. Krishna, in the Bhagavad Gita, makes a similar promise. While Christians regard Buddha as a hidden teacher, whose teachings were amazingly akin to those of Jesus, and whose moral code for pureness, excellence, and wisdom, is second only to that of the divine lawgiver himself, the Buddhists freely acknowledge Jesus as a divine messenger sent to teach the heathen of the Western worlds, a Buddha of the West. In fact, I-section our students, familiar with the inner teachings of the Hindu philosophy, have been able to read into Buddhism the fundamental truths, according to the interpretation of Gautama, and to trace the differences and correspondences between it and the several other systems. The point of the greatest difference between our own teachings and those of Buddha is regarding the extremely pessimistic view of the universe, the dwelling upon the pain, and overlooking the joy. Life is neither joy nor pain, but a commingling of both. He who puts on the blue spectacles of pessimism sees everything blue, while he who dons the rose-colored spectacles of optimism sees everything rosy. The pure clear glasses of understanding sees neither color, but everything in its relation and true coloring. Another great point of difference is that in which Gautama pictures that allowing itself to be the subject to illusion and avidya, and involved in the baleful samsara existence, this being a tendency among the majority of Hindu philosophies. To us, the absolute that Brahman is not deluded or fooled by avidya or maya, but is pursuing a divine plan of manifestation and mental creation, in full knowledge and wisdom, for purposes and ends unknown to man, but satisfactory to the divine knowing, and which has always ultimate justice and absolute good in view, guided by the light of infinite love. This is the antidote for pessimism. Special message 7 for this month: we invite you to participate in the contemplation and consideration of the following gems of spiritual truth, gathered from the inexhaustible mines of the Hindu thought. This is the truth. That is the truth. All is in truth and truth is in all. Truth cannot be added to, nor subtracted from. Add all to the truth, and the truth remains. Subtract all from the truth, and the truth remains. The truth is that which when gained, there is naught else to gain the bliss of which experienced. There is no other bliss to be experienced which, when seen, there is naught else to be seen which once known, there is naught else to be known. As the sun contains all light, and in itself there is neither day nor night, so in truth, which is all wisdom, there is neither knowledge nor ignorance. Truth is beyond sound, touch, form, taste, and smell, beyond beginning and ending, beyond involution and evolution. Those who realize this saying, also escape these attributes of ignorance. I cannot see, nor mind know truth, and yet there is that within each by which it may be seen, and may be known. None can this riddle see, unless he hath both seen and known. There is a stated bliss absolute, wherein one does not see another, nor does he hear another, nor does he know another. States in which one sees another, hears another, know another are not bliss absolute. Bliss absolute is immortal mind. Aught else is mortal mind. Where is bliss absolute to be found? Everywhere, or nowhere, say the sages. Where is the truth? Above, below, north, south, east, west, up, down, high, low, without, within. Many who seek it, find it not. Many who seek it not, find it. He knows and sees the truth, becomes filled with bliss absolute, and becomes a lord. To him is opened the door or doors that lead to worlds above and worlds below. The truth is ever awake, even when asleep. As the sun lighteth many things not resembling it, so does the light of the truth illumine many minds, high and low, each thinking the light its own. Only the wise perceive that in the mind there is no light, other than the light of the truth, shining therein. Our meditation, for the coming month is, the truth is to be sought everywhere, for everywhere abideth it.